Welcome to the last week of actual class. Next week is finals week, so you still have work to do, and so do I. But it's the last week of reading chapters, doing papers, and my lectures. And this week, this final week of this term, now next term, if any of you are interested in taking it, it's full, I think, is Soc 205. Maybe some of you already are. So this is the first in a three-term sequence, Soc 205, Soc 204, 205, and then 206, spring term is social problems. So anyway, let's move into this last final chapter for this term, which is gender and sex and gender. So there are a lot of learning objectives at the beginning of the chapter, but I picked out the three that I think are really important. The difference between sex and gender, that's huge. I have spent days in class working this through, with questions from students and discussion and all of that. It's huge because many people use those terms interchangeably, sex and gender, and they're two completely different things, as you will see. And then gender stratification is another important aspect of this chapter, and the sexual scripts and double standards that we all adhere to or reject, rebel from, whatever, but they're very important in our lives. So this first section is called Sex, Gender, and Culture, and this is where we learn that sex is biological, gender is cultural. And that's difficult for a lot of people to grasp, but hopefully this will help clarify it if you don't already know that or haven't already grasped it. So sex is the biological characteristics with which we are born. Most of us are born either male or female. As you'll see, that's not true for everyone here in a minute, but that's what's true for most of us. So the sex aspects that are the biological are things like the chromosomes, anatomy, hormones, and other physical and physiological characteristics. Those physical characteristics certainly may influence our behavior. If you think about men shaving beards and women wearing bras, that type of thing, then yes, they do affect our behaviors, but those behaviors are coming from the physical characteristics. And those physical characteristics, here's the key point where people often are, I won't say confused, it's what we've kind of been taught in a sense, or we think of as common knowledge, but it isn't necessarily, that those physical characteristics don't determine how we think or how we feel. Those are determined by cultural aspects. So now let's look at gender. Gender are the learned attitudes and behaviors that characterize women and men, or we think of them in a particular culture of characterizing women and men. So although most people are born either male or female, here's where we're going to get into this, further into the comment I made earlier that that's not necessarily true. There is not necessarily exactly that way. We learn to be women or men by internalizing the behavior that's expected of each sex. So this is the key here to gender. Although most people are born either female or male, we learn, and learn is the key word here, to be women or men by internalizing the behavior expected of each sex. Now, here's sex. Sex is the biological component, as we mentioned a few minutes ago. But it's not always clear-cut. This is interesting. There are a number of people that are on the boundaries of both sexes, of both male and female. I don't know if you know this, many of you nursing students would, and many of the rest of you would too, but I find that most people don't know this. All fetuses are female by default. And that differentiation into maleness happens, it begins at around 7 weeks when male genitalia begin to develop. And that's when the Y chromosome signals for the start of testosterone to be produced. So at about 9 weeks, after that first begins at 7 weeks, then a boy baby's genitals begin to the process of becoming male. So here's another interesting point. I don't know if you're aware that there are more spontaneous abortions, i.e., miscarriages of male infants. There are more birth defects with male infants. Male infants have a higher uh, uh, death rate within the first year, infant mortality rate. And there's a lot of discussion about the fact that much can go wrong if a huge change has to happen in a fetus. That doesn't happen for the females. So from that, when that Y chromosome kicks into the release of testosterone, or the production actually of testosterone. So some people are intersexed. I think Jamie Lee Curtis is probably the most famous out intersex person that I'm aware of. And that's people, those are people whose sex at birth isn't either male or female. It's, you know, something in between. So about 1 in 2,000 to 4,000, depending on who's doing the studies, et cetera, babies are born each year that are classified as intersex. And they're born with either both male and female external genitalia or incompletely developed internal reproductive organs. So some parents agree to immediately do some sort of operation to make the child either male or female. We learned about that with Jeannie and not Jeannie, excuse me, with David Bailey and a few last couple of chapters ago. And other parents agree to wait. And particularly in the modern days now, people are waiting more to let the child make, when they're old enough, to make a decision about how they think of their own gender identity. So here we're now at sexual identity and orientation. Sexual identity is an awareness of ourselves as either male or female. And we'll get to other possibilities in a minute, but we're starting with that. And how we express our sexual values and attitudes and feelings. That's our sexual identity. One could say neither of the above. If you're gonna, if this book says that awareness of ourselves is male or female, you know, there are other ways of thinking about that. I'm back. Dealing with a puppy while you're recording is, if I lock him out of the upstairs here, and no one else is home, he'll go crazy. So that's why he's here. Okay, so sexual identity. That's our awareness of ourselves as either male or female, or where we are on that scale, and how we then express the sexual values and attitudes and feelings associated with that identity. Sexual orientation is a preference for sexual partners of the same sex, the opposite sex, both sexes, or neither sex, asexual people who just aren't interested in sex. And that's along a continuum. In a classroom, I always put up a line on the board with little X's across it, because no one's 100% female. Men have, females have testosterone. Nobody's 100%, male. Males have female hormones. And as we age, that balance changes dramatically, of course. So we're all somewhere on a continuum in terms of, you're just going to look purely at hormones, for example. So our attraction, our sexual orientation can also be along a continuum. And in terms of, as I said, sexual attraction, our feelings, our fantasies, etc. Most people's sexual identity corresponds with their biological sex, attraction, behavior, all of those things, but not always. And you look at, here's some statistics. Americans between 35 and 44 tend to identify themselves as straight or cisgender, but at the same time that most of them are identifying themselves, that as straight or cisgender, it turns out that almost a quarter of them have had sex experiences with same-sex experiences. So how many Americans are LGBT? Now, Q, as you know, all of this, I'm sure, anything about where people have to self-identify to find out what's going on, for the most part, self-identify. It's very hard to get accurate statistics. So this is what we know, and then there are some assumptions that have been made based on, um, you know, self-disclosures and a variety of other things. So self-identification in recent years has certainly increased with people being LGBTQ. Women are more likely than men to identify that way. And some of the explanations of higher numbers of more people coming out, as we say, are now in this day and age, over 63, 70, between 63 and 70% say in America, say that being gay or lesbian or LGBTQ is okay. Well, it didn't used to be, so it wasn't as comfortable for people to identify as you might imagine. Consequences were very strong. In England, you could be, thrown in jail until not too long ago. So therefore, people are more willing to identify as acceptance increases. And then there's the whole age thing, different generational attitudes. The millennials, who are from 1982 to 2004, are much more likely to reject traditional sexual orientation categories. So what determines sexual orientation? Well, remember we've said already, and this is re-emphasizing it here, that culture shapes people's sexual attitudes and behaviors, but no one knows what actually determines sexual orientation. There is so much research about that, and there's just nothing definitive. But most researchers think that there must be biological roots or basis to sexual orientation, because homosexuality exists in all cultures across the globe. I mean, obviously, it's more accepted in some than others, but it exists as far as anthropologists know, all over the globe. In fact, there's the rough estimate is that about 5% of the world's population is homosexual. I have seen the figure of 11%, much more frequently than the 5% that this book gives. So there's growing scientific consensus that biological factors, especially the early influence of those sex hormones we were talking about after conception and around childbirth, might have a very, very strong effect on sexual orientation. Other researchers see it as a 50-50 nature versus nurture, combination of genetic and cultural factors that influence one's sexual orientation. So now that was the sex part. Now we're going to look at the gender piece here, and that's the cultural component. So if you're looking at that, then the statement is made by social scientists that gender is socially constructed. Not sex, gender is socially constructed. Our gender identity is a perception of oneself as either masculine or feminine early in life, or not, right? But early in life is when that socialization is imposed upon us. Little girls get their ears pierced, little boys don't, obviously. The hairstyles and clothing, and I think we talked about this in another lecture, the kind of shower gifts that we give people. Because now with amniocentesis and ultrasound, we know what sex the baby is before it's born. And so, you get very different gifts for the shower for a girl baby than a boy baby. It starts before birth. The colors that nurseries are painted, if you have an extra room, is going to be a nursery, that type of thing. So it typically, corresponds to what the biological sex, right, of that baby is. And so it becomes all or part of one's self-concept. Unless it doesn't work for you. And then it gets much more complicated, doesn't it? So Transgender is kind of an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and behavior do not correspond with their birth sex. And then gender expression is how a person communicates their gender identity to others, which is behaviors, clothing, hairstyles, voice, or body characteristics. Now let's look at gender roles, gender stereotypes, and sexism. So gender roles are the characteristics, attitudes, feelings, and behaviors that society expects of you, and this is still true in this very delineated male versus female way of thinking about behaviors, attitudes, the way you dress, your hairstyle, all of that sort of thing. It's kind of what society expects of males and females. So gender stereotypes are things like the expectations of how people will look, act, think, and feel based on their sex. And so there's something, Impressions from an Office, a file I put up this week for you to read. These are a few things, not from that particular one that I had, but from your textbook, about how we describe the same behaviors differently for men and for women. So that one I put up is called Impressions from an Office, that file. But here's a few from your textbook. He's firm, she's stubborn. Same behavior, but one is okay for a male and one isn't, right? And so it has a different connotation when a female acts that way. He's good with details, she's picky. He's honest, she's opinionated. And you can look at the laundry list, as I said, on the thing that I uploaded for you. So those are ideas of gender stereotypes. What's sexism? Well, we know the isms, right? Sexism, racism, ageism, et cetera, you can go on and on. Sexism is an attitude or behavior that discriminates against one sex, and it's usually females, unfortunately, based on the assumed superiority of the other sex. The example, I couldn't list it, I don't have time to read all the examples and list them that are in your book, but the one that struck me that I thought you could relate to the most is the fact that J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter books, couldn't get her book published. It was rejected by many publishers when she used her actual name, which was Joanne, J.K. Rowling. And finally, somebody said to her, just do your initials. Don't identify as a female, just put your initials. And the book was picked up almost immediately. You know what happened after that. She's one of the richest women in the world from the amount of book sales. So that's an example of sexism. Do men experience sexism? They do. And it's often, the example I give you in the text there is a mom who forced her son, who wanted to be a ballet dancer, into sports. And that's a very powerful thing that happens to a lot of males. There's a whole wonderful film, and it became a Broadway show about that very issue. It's called Billy Elliot. I would suggest you look it up and see it if you're interested in these issues. About a young British boy from a working class mining family. Can you imagine that? Who wanted to be a ballet dancer. And the struggles that he went through with his father, especially, and his brother, older brothers, et cetera. He's a younger son. So what are the societal? So if those stereotypes, if those ideas are so strongly ingrained in us about maleness and femaleness and the value of one over the other, I mean, that's what really freaks parents and people out about males wanting to do something that's considered feminine, like ballet dancing or dress designing or something, is because why would you want to do something that the oppressed person wants to do? Why would you want to do something, not only is it feminine, but part of the reason it's so looked down upon is because of sexism, that something females do is less valued than the things that males do. So the societal reactions to LGBTQs has gotten much better, much greater acceptance in the last, 10, 15 years. The Australian passports have male, female, and transgender specifications on them, classifications, excuse me. And, the Biden administration just passed the gender X category for our passports in America. And so there are other countries that do that as well. That's just one example of how the institutions are beginning to change around this issue. But Americans, as accepting as many of us are, still divided, especially on two issues. Um, and they tend to both have come from the religious right. But the first one is the whole weddings situation, wedding related businesses. Should a caterer be obliged to cater for a gay wedding? Should a pastor be obliged to marry a gay couple, etc.? And then restrooms is the other one that just seems to freak people out the most. Should they correspond to their original sex identification or to their current gender identification? One of the easiest ways to deal with that is to have unisex bathrooms, which many places, I think there are more of those now than there are ones that are divvied up, and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. But having looked at some of the improvements that are happening, especially the institutional ones like the passport thing, that type of thing, there's also very widespread intolerance, as you might imagine. So heterosexism is the term for that. The belief that heterosexuality is the only legitimate sexual orientation. And then homophobia, phobia means fear of, like arachnophobia with spiders and that type of thing. Homophobia is a fear or hatred of lesbians and gays. And of all hate crimes that are perpetrated on, annually, the statistics are taken, race is the first one, racial hate crimes, but the homophobic hate crimes are the second highest number of hate crimes in the United States. So let's look at contemporary gender inequality right now. So there's a recent study. This is more bad news. It'll take until 2085 for women to reach parity with men in leadership roles, and that's in government and politics, business, entrepreneurship, and nonprofit organizations. Till 2085, we're 51% of the population in the United States, by the way. Gendered institutions are social structures that enable and reinforce gender stratification. And now we're going to go through some of those institutions, and the family is the first and probably the most powerful institution. So gender and family life. So you can look, there's a table there, a figure on this in this chapter about how parents spend their time divided by mothers and fathers. So 50% of couples in America, with or without children, say that doing household chores, sharing them, is a very important to a successful marriage. Now, men do more than they used to do, which was virtually nothing several generations ago around the house, but they still do a lot less than they think they do or say they do. For example, they spend more out, and part of the reason is in a way it's justifiable. They spend more hours in paid work than mothers, but they do less childcare and housework and have more leisure time than mothers do. Even though they're working more hours at work, they have more leisure time than mothers do. And many household chores, as I'm sure many of you know, are still very gendered. So men tend to do more of things that have to do with home maintenance and, repairing cars, lawnmowers, and that type of thing. Women are 3 times more likely to do cooking, cleaning, and laundry. And by the way, the men were 3 times more likely to do what they do as well, those gendered roles. So 58% of Americans say parenting is, quote, extremely important to their identity. But the parenting tasks are also gendered because dads tend to do more of the fun things or the enjoyable tasks with kids. Playing, taking them to games. They're more likely to join in and help mothers with the care of them if they're doing that, bathing or something, rather than actually taking it over and doing it by themselves. And mothers do, as many of us, well, I remember, my kids are grown now, but a lot of you were right there in the middle of it. Do most of the daily nonstop tasks, picking kids up from school and daycare, feeding them, bathing them, and putting them to bed, taking care of them when they're sick. And so mothers compared to fathers, as you might imagine, have less happiness, more stress, and greater fatigue than fathers do. Gender and education, that's another institution. Now this section is a little confusing because it's not looking at what happens with the kids in education. It's looking at what the people who work in education, and the disparity between males and females. So K through 12 schools, public K through 12 schools, as rank in pay increases, the number of women decreases. Among all full-time teachers, 76% of elementary teachers are women, and that falls to 58% women teachers when you get to high school. Even with doctoral degrees, women in STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, are less likely than men to be hired, and once they're hired, they're less likely to be promoted. So, gender in the workplace, has been there's been progress, but there's a long way to go. There's, as most of us are aware, occupational sex and gender segregation, which is the process of channeling women into different types of jobs than men, and men into different types of jobs than women. And in some U.S. occupational fields, they're almost entirely inhabited by one sex or the other. For instance, 95 to 98% of all childcare workers are women. So are secretaries, dental hygienists, and preschool kindergarten teachers. Every time I go to if I change dentists or something, or they get a new hygienist, I wonder if there's going to be a male hygienist. I did find a female dentist at one the other day, which was interesting. The same percentage of men, 95 to 98%, occupy positions as pilots, mechanics, plumbers, firefighters. I would throw dentists in there. There's progress in some of the higher paying occupations, but 74% of chief executives, 80% of software developers, and 90% of engineers are men. The issue here is, you could say, well, so what? Well, the difference is the amount of money those professions make. So the issue is that male-dominated occupations usually pay much higher wages. So now we're in the gender pay gap, the difference, which is the difference between men's and women's earnings. On average, full-time, year-round, working women earn 80 to 81 cents for every dollar that men earn. At that rate, what that means is the average woman works almost 9 extra weeks every year to make the same wage as a man. And that is what the gender pay gap is. If you're curious when you hear that term, that's what it's referring to, is the amount of hours, days, weeks a woman has to work to at the average, wage for women as opposed to the average wage for men in the U.S. to make the same amount. So lower, what happens is that those lower wages and salaries reduce women's savings, the ability to save money, the ability to purchase what they need to survive. Their quality of life is less. They receive less from Social Security, and they receive less from pensions, because your Social Security and your pensions depend on your salary. Okay? So women earn less than men at all educational levels, and here's a sad note: the higher the educational level, the greater the gap. Okay? It doesn't get better as you go up the educational level. The gap gets wider. Now, don't let that discourage you about getting advanced degrees, you women, because you're going to make a lot more money than you would with non-advanced degrees. It's just that you're not going to make as much as the men with advanced degrees make. So why is there a gender pay gap? Well, first of all, women tend to choose fields that pay less. So healthcare, education. And when they're referring to healthcare in the book, they're not talking about doctors. They're talking about assistants and home health care aides and, nursing homes, that type of thing. Men are more likely to choose higher paying fields. Engineering and computer science are examples. So between the age, this is really shocking, between the ages of 25 and 45, the gender pay gap for college graduates begins at close to zero. Okay. Hired in, it's more or less the same, not a huge gap. But by age 45, that pay gap has widened to 55% from close to zero. So over a career. A year after graduation, women in STEM earn less than 31% than men in STEM professions do. So that one stands out it's even worse than the ones that it takes till you're 45 to have this huge discrepancy. What about sexual harassment? Well, sexual harassment is any unwanted sexual advance, request for sexual favors, or other conduct of a sexual nature that makes a person uncomfortable and interferes with her or his work and includes verbal behavior, nonverbal, and physical contact. And as you are probably aware, it occurs at all occupational levels, from the lowest to the very highest. We've seen some examples at the very highest in the last few years. Approximately 25% of women have been sexually harassed at work. 71% of those didn't file complaints. The figure is much higher. You can find them up to over 50%. I think those are the ones that were reported, even though it didn't state that, to get as low as 25%. So, and then on top of that, many companies have arbitration clauses that prohibit you from suing them for sexual harassment. So you couldn't, even if you wanted to, report it or sue them. What about our political system? We're looking at gendered systems now, right? So, or institutions, gendered politics. The US, as you know, has never had a woman president. We finally have a woman vice president. And you might remember some of the ideas and feelings and thoughts and attitudes that went around when we had a woman running for president and with Hillary Clinton. The U.S. Congress, 81% of the members are men. That's what your book says. Now, I looked it up because I know there's the greatest percentage of women in Congress than there have ever been. So I just, Googled it and looked it up. Now, it's 73% men. So 73 to 75% men. We're still, remember, 51% of the population, but that's the highest percentage of women ever. It doesn't mean it will stay that way or continue that way. Okay? That's the way it is now with this last election. Now, women's voting rates are higher than men's and have been since 1984. So why are there so few women in office, do you think? Well, fewer women run for office than men because they don't think of themselves as being qualified. They have to do more and have all their lives to prove themselves as equal as they can prove themselves to be to men. U.S. presidents appoint more men than women to important positions, so they're gaining all that experience and, social ties and networking and that type of thing. And there's a lingering sexism between both men and women, that female politicians are less feminine and compassionate than the average woman. I remember this discussion when Hillary Clinton was running as well. Oh, she's tough as nails, and she, for a man that would be a compliment, right? But not for a woman, whether she was or not tough as nails. That was a comment that was made about her. No empathy, no compassion. The one time she did cry, all hell broke loose, right? Because then she wasn't strong enough. And also, another reason there aren't as many women in politics is because they lack the leadership traits often that are associated with male politicians, which is a lot of confidence and being very assertive. We'll go back to that list of what I read you about the difference, between how the same behaviors are interpreted, whether you're male or female. Look at the impressions from an office. Assertive, that's a very powerful male strength, but being assertive for a female is being too loud, too forward, too opinionated, too bitchy, too, whatever. Too. Okay, so let's look at sexuality. They mention Annie Hall, the film, Woody Allen and Diane Keaton film Annie Hall at the beginning of the book. I tried to find a clip of this scene and couldn't find it for free to put up for you to stream. There's a hysterical scene, and that's what they're referring to in your text, in Annie Hall, where they live together. They're not married, but they've been together for ages. And they each go to a different therapist because their relationship isn't working. And they have a split screen where they have Woody Allen talking to his therapist and Diane Keaton talking to her therapist. And Woody Allen's therapist says, well, how's the sex? How's your sex life? And Woody Allen kind of goes, oh, God, it's awful. We only have sex like a couple of times a week, something like that. It's just never, basically. Diane Keaton's talking to her therapist. Her therapist asks her the same question, and she says, oh my God, it's all the time. He never leaves me alone. So and that's what they're referring to here in your textbook about that. When the Annie Hall reference, if you're not old enough to know the film Annie Hall or know what that was about, it's attitudes, isn't it? And once again, there's so much based on gender and our expectations. So let's look at contemporary sexual attitudes. Why we have sex is the heading of this section. You want to what? Well, because what they're trying to say is research shows there's other reasons than just reproduction and pleasure to have sex. I thought this interested me. A study of 2,000 college students identified 237 reasons for having sex that ranged from stress reduction to the spiritual. So there you go. Anywhere in those 237. What are sexual scripts and double standards? Sexual scripts they kind of tell us, they specify the formal and informal norms for acceptable and unacceptable sexual behavior. The biggest example for thousands of years has been guys who have a lot of sex are studs. They're, I know that's a dated term. I'm sure there's a much more modern term about that. And the women who have a lot of sex, if they're not moms and married and all of that, and then you wouldn't even know, are sluts or whores or whatever, That is a sexual script. And it's certainly a double standard, isn't it? So the other part that they're talking about here in this section about sexual scripts is the sexy babe trend. I have noticed this a lot. It's really how younger and younger women, and not even women, girls, are becoming sexualized. And it's really disturbing. Media images perpetuate that. Social media certainly perpetuates that. I love the photo in this section of the life-size Barbie standing next to the real woman to see that how impossible her physique and the Barbie physique would ever be for a real person. Well, who benefits from this? Sexualizing of hypersexualizing, as your book calls it, and that's true. That is what it is. Who benefits from it? Well, guess what? It's marketing, and it's capitalism, it's commercialism, it's making money, making everything, including human beings and young girls, commodities. And then we talked about the sexual double standard. It comes up in this, but the definition is a code that permits greater sexual freedom for men than for women. So let's look at very briefly just a couple of the current issues about sexuality that they bring up in the book. One is abortion. There's a table about who has abortions on page 172 that's very interesting to look at. And as you know, or you may not know, the abortion rates have dropped dramatically since 1973. And part of that is because at least half the states have restricted access to abortion. Some form of restricted access that so far doesn't interfere with the 1972 Roe v. Wade constitutional amendment. So there have been restrictions which have led to a drop in pregnancy rates. That's part of it, but that's not all of it. Social scientists are still interested. Of course, our birth rate has dropped. A whole bunch of things have declined. Same-sex marriage. Well, that was legalized in 2015. So that was a huge thing, a huge difference that happened there. And of course, we may have a very huge change happening in terms of abortion as well in the country. Let's look at gender and sexuality across cultures. Okay, there is an enormous amount of variation on the idea of male and female acceptability of behaviors, what's expected, that type of thing across cultures. Okay. There's also an awful lot of difference in terms of gender inequality or equality and sexual oppression, all of which shows that our behavior is learned. It's not hardwired. I mean, I think that this is the hardest thing to get through in learning about sex and gender, is that so much of it is not hardwired. Not that there isn't some that is, for sure. And, that changes. We know we can observe that over the lifespan, right? The raging hormones of adolescence and early adulthood to the waning ones of old age. So, sure, there's definitely an effect there, excuse me, of biology. But the fact that there's so many different ways of being male and female across the world, there's so much oppression in some place and relative equality. In others, there's matrilineal, what you might think of as being called matriarchal cultures in some places, tells us that it isn't hardwired. But gender inequality, having said all of that, it is the norm. It is the norm. It doesn't mean that it's hardwired. It just means that there are more cultures, many more cultures, that have gender inequality than don't. So in all countries and regions, the greatest gender gaps are in, where there are gender gaps, are in economic participation and political leadership. In terms of economic participation, we went through that for the US here a few minutes ago, but in worldwide, there's 150 countries that have at least one law that treats women differently. 63 countries have 5 or more laws that treat women differently. Had to get some water. And those are things like laws that make it difficult or illegal for women to own property, open bank accounts, start businesses, or enter certain professions. Globally, women earn about 24% less than men. But even in developed countries like Scandinavia that have the greatest gender equality, the lowest gender wage gap, there are problems. And they give you Germany as an example. Germany's Europe's #1 economy, but it also has one of the largest pay gaps in the European Union. In political leadership, it's just as bad, if not worse. Only 23% worldwide of national legislators are women. Interestingly, Rwanda has the greatest amount of women in political positions of power, 64%. And there are 9 other countries that follow Rwanda where women hold 40 to 46% of high-level positions. But if you look worldwide at the leaders who are either presidents or prime ministers, in other words, the top guy, it is a guy. It's only 13% of those are women. So now let's look at sexual inequality, and as I'm sure you know, violence against women is a very persistent problem worldwide. You can look in the book at the statistics for Afghanistan and Pakistan and Congo and India, and then if you throw in, female genital mutilation for hundreds of thousands of young girls and women, it's very bad. It really is. Is there violence against males? Well, yes, there is, but it tends to be against homosexual males, males that go, or transgender males that go against the accepted behavior of maleness, right? So we are, industrialized, developed nations are certainly doing better about that in terms of legalizing gay marriage and making it not criminal and that type of thing in other countries where it was. But in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, they just don't accept or tolerate any LGBTQ. You could be stoned, murdered, tortured, thrown in jail, whatever. And Russia recently banned LGBTQ relationships. I'm going backwards. So let's look at the three sociological, four in this textbook, I keep forgetting, theories of gender inequality. So let's start with functionalism. Well, functionalism, as you might say, it might, guess by now, you should know this. It's the don't worry, be happy, everything's fine, the way it is kind of theory. Women and men, what they're saying is that women and men have distinct roles that ensure a family's and society's survival. It's the distinct roles part that can be problematic there. And you can see as we go through this, it's the perfect 1950s, Leave It to Beaver family idea that the functionalists have about the family. So what they say that the reason it's functional is that it's the division of roles and human capital. That gender roles differ because women and men have distinct roles and responsibility. The man plays the instrumental role. Remember, we learned about instrumental and expressive in a previous chapter. So the man plays the instrumental role of economic power. He's competitive and he works hard. The woman plays the expressive role of caregiving, basically emotionally as well as physically. So emotional nurturance that sustains the family unit and supports the father and husband. Those instrumental and expressive roles are complementary to one another, and each person knows, hopefully, theoretically, what's expected of them. If the house is clean, she's a good wife. If the bills are paid, he's a good husband. That's simplifying it a lot, but you get the point. So and from a functionalist perspective, those traditional gender roles help explain the occupational sex segregation that we just learned about or talked about, because people differ in the amount of what's called human capital that they bring to the table. That human capital are the competencies that you have, like education. How much education do you have? Job training, skills, experience that you can bring to the labor market. Well, the more you have of every of those things, the better off you're going to be in the job market, right? So from the functionalist perspective, what people earn is the result of choices that they made, and consequently the human capital they accumulate. We know that people don't now, you should, after this much sociology, people don't always get to make those choices about how much education, job training, skills, and experience they have. But that's from the functionalist perspective. So what they see is kind of like blaming the victim. So what the functionalists say is, well, wait a minute. Now, you didn't make those choices, women. So women diminish their human capital by choosing lower paying jobs. And their example is social work versus computer science. It's true. Women do that. They gravitate towards those caretaking, elementary school teachers, social worker, right, or male helpers, dental hygienists kind of jobs. Luckily, female hygienists make a lot of money. And then also women postpone or leave the workforce to raise children, and when they return, they have lower earnings. That's true too, but it doesn't have to be that way. Other industrialized nations, every other country virtually has paid family leave, so that you can stay home and not lose your money, that your job is guaranteed at the same level when you go back, et cetera, et cetera. So why is sexuality important? The functionalists say that sexuality, we're in the functionalist perspective now, it's important for reproduction. Well, that's true, of course. It's critical for reproduction. Well, why can't you have reproduction outside of marriage? They view sex outside of marriage as dysfunctional because unmarried fathers don't support their children. That's unfortunately true in America, at any rate. And therefore, the offspring usually suffer poverty and lower educational levels, all the things we learned about in the social class chapter. So worldwide, sex outside of marriage is prohibited in many cultures, and as you know, arranged marriages are very common. Now, the conflict theory says gender inequality is built into the social structure, that in both developed and developing countries, men are in control of most of the resources that a society has, and they dominate women. Like functionalists, conflict theorists view sexuality as a key component of society's organization, but it reflects and perpetuates sexism and discrimination. It isn't functional in the way that functionalists think that it is or say that it is. And then, of course, because they're conflict theorists, they're going to analyze this through the lens of capitalism. And what they say is capitalism does not create complementary roles and gender roles. It really, the kind of gender roles that capitalism promotes benefits men's social and has social and economic advantages for males. And that women's inequality is mostly due to economic exploitation. And part of that exploitation, think about this, women, is the unpaid workforce. And underpaid workforce, motel maids, let's just take that for example, and unpaid domestic workers at home. You know, you could work all your life raising a bunch of great kids who go on to do great things and not have a job, as many of our mothers and grandmothers and great grandmothers and before them, right? You have worked huge amount of hours, you know, cooking, cleaning, caretaking, illness, you know, running people around, whatever, supporting the man in the family with great dinners and all that. You know what? You're not eligible for Social Security. You didn't work, quote, you didn't, quote, work, right? You can, yes, when your husband, you can collect your husband's Social Security if he dies. But that's been something that women activists have talked about for years, that unpaid work that women do constantly. So in effect, what the conflict theory says is that gender roles are very profitable for business, right? Women are 51% of the population. Congress is overwhelmingly like the face of corporate America, white and male. So is gender inequality linked to sexual inequality? Well, if you give one person, gender, race, age, whatever you want to use as an example, more power, more economic, political, and interpersonal power, then they can dominate. So in this case, we're talking about gender. You give more men more economic, political, and or interpersonal power, and they can control and dominate women's lives. Most direct domestic rape victims in the US and worldwide, of course, are women and girls, not men and boys. Not that there are not men and boys. We're talking about the vast majority are women and girls. In the workplace, sexual harassment is so common, and the offender is typically a male supervisor, not an equal, someone with more power. Prostitution and trafficking, almost all of the victims worldwide are poor women and girls. Not women and girls from middle class or upper class homes. No, they're poor. They're from poor families. Now let's look at feminist theories. Well, as you might imagine, they're pretty much the same as the conflict. It is a form of the conflict theory. They just focus, but what they do is they focus more on women's daily vulnerability to male violence. So in this section called Living in a Gendered World, in this part of the book, men, 48% of the US population, men are 48% of the US population that's 18 and older, but they account for 98% of the directors of the 700 top grossing films, the directors, since 2007. Okay. They're a smaller percentage men than of women, but all those 700 top grossing films from 2007, 100% of them were directed by men. Now that's a big issue in Hollywood right now, isn't it? In getting women to actually produce, create, direct, write films. 96% of all Fortune 500 companies are run by men. 75% of Congress, as we just talked about, 76, et cetera, et cetera. You can go on and on. There's an awful lot of examples there in your text. So feminist theorists emphasize that gender, race, and social class intersect to form hierarchical stratification systems that shapes our behaviors and experiences. It shapes women's and it shapes men's as well, and what we expect, right? So upper class, and interestingly, in those intersections, it turns out that upper class men and women subordinate not only lower class women, but minority men as well. And then there's the whole aspect that the feminist argument brings up about uh, sexuality and social control and the selling of sex, the commodifying of sex. And that is really disgusting. I'm sure you know that pornography is the biggest part of the internet. It's the most, I forget the percentage now, and I meant to look it up and forgot, but it is by far the largest hits on the internet worldwide is pornography. Let's quickly look at symbolic interaction. I only have a few minutes left here before this is going to run out of time. So it focuses on the everyday processes that produce and reinforce gender roles and how we do gender from the expectations and how we've been socialized. And it emphasizes that our gender expression is not hardwired, but that it's a product of our socialization. So, it's a social construction of reality. Gender is, and sexuality, just like everything from a social constructionist, interactionist, is a social construction of reality. Because we learn to be sexual, we learn to express our sexuality differently over times and with different groups and in different ways through the people that we were, that imprinted us really like little ducklings or something, with what it meant to be female, what it meant to be male, and how, in many, many cases, how unacceptable it was to not be be that stereotypical way. All right. Well, I've enjoyed being with you this term, even though I've talked to some of you via email and getting to know you and reading your papers and things. It's been interesting. So thank you for this term.